have ignition sequence start. The engines are armed. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit. We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Looking good.
Any of you gentlemen like to run for public office? That was wonderful. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm David Mosina, the President and CEO of the Museum of Science and Industry. I'd like to welcome you here tonight in this wonderful event. You are in for an incredible, historic evening. Like many of you, the story of Apollo 8 is ingrained in my memory. Hearing those rockets going off, the sound of those engines, hearing the historic Christmas broadcast on Christmas Eve, and feeling the collective excitement when the crew splashed down safely. I'm truly honored to be here tonight to celebrate the Apollo 8 mission and its trailblazing crew. They risked absolutely everything to show the world the possibilities of space exploration. The spirit of Apollo 8 embodies everything the museum holds dear: curiosity, passion, and the willingness to push the limits of possibility. But that kind of work is never easy. There were many, many big challenges, big risks, and a very, very real danger for themselves, their families, and our country. The result is one of the most spectacular scientific and technical feats of all time: putting humans into lunar orbit and letting human eyes see the far side of the moon for the very first time. This mission led to remarkable advancements across STEM fields, while its stories and images captivated the world. Before you leave this evening, I invite you to visit Apollo 8 in our Henry Crown Space Center. What the men here tonight accomplished in this capsule is absolutely astounding. And if you haven't seen the capsule, you will not believe how tightly they were together. It's no surprise that nearly 50 years later, the story of Apollo 8 continues to inspire. It remains a powerful example of what we can accomplish together when vision, passion, and determination allow us to see past obstacles and limitations. Again, please join me in a round of applause for the Apollo 8 crew: Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. And now I would like to introduce Robert Kurson, the wonderful author of this riveting book, Rocket Men. Robert's a great friend of MSI. His great book kept me up way past bedtime last night. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Kurson. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. The turnout is extraordinary, and I know we're all grateful to you for coming out tonight. Before anything, I'd like to thank the following people: David Messina, Brad Sheaver, Maurice Moore, and everyone at the Museum of Science and Industry for hosting this event and for running such a first-class operation. To Random House, my publisher, for producing such a beautiful book. Susie Takis at the Bookseller, one of the great independent bookstores in the country. My wife, Amy, my boys, Nate and Will, my brother, Ken, sister Jane, brother-in-law, Larry, and other family and friends who supported me during the writing of Rocket Men. More than anything, I'd like to thank the 3 Apollo 8 crewmen who are here with us tonight to celebrate the 50th anniversary of one of humanity's greatest achievements, the first manned flight to the moon. I'd especially like to thank Susan Borman, Marilyn Lovell, and Valerie Anders, the wives of the 3 astronauts, without whom I came to see very clearly and early on this mission could not have happened. I learned unforgettable lessons about love and support from these heroic women, and I'll remain grateful for that forever. And with that, let me tell you how Rocket Men got its liftoff. In late 2014, I took some friends to this very place, the Great Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, my hometown. Every kid who grew up in this area has the museum in his or her DNA. It's a place of field trips and adventure, of discovery and giant cafeterias and getting lost in great halls, of things larger and smaller than life. It is heaven. I'd taken those friends to see U-505, the German U-boat that's one of the centerpiece attractions here, and a perfect match for the submarine I wrote about in my first book, Shadow Divers. On the way out, we came across a space capsule, about 10 feet tall by 13 feet wide. It appeared to be scarred from its journey, wherever it had gone, and its open hatch revealed 3 cramped seats and a universe of controls inside. Kids circled around the spacecraft, which looked at once to have come from the past and the future. A nearby placard announced that this was the command module of Apollo 8, which had carried the first men ever, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, to the moon. I knew almost nothing about that mission. Like many, I was familiar with the story of Apollo 11, man's first lunar landing, and of Apollo 13, when an explosion on board the spacecraft nearly resulted in tragedy. A few days later, I got around to reading about Apollo 8. What I found was one of the most incredible stories in American history. Apollo 8 had everything: daring, adventure, risk-taking, a race against time that came down to the final hours, an existential battle against a magnificent adversary. It blended cutting-edge science and technology with the eternal human yearning to explore. It told of the power of 3 unbreakable women and the love of children and family, of America's ability to do the impossible when pushed to its limits, of the moment when mankind first reached the place that had called to it for eternity, the moon. It told of a single photograph taken by Bill Anders that became among the most famous of all time and that changed how humanity viewed itself. It told of how 3 men lived extraordinary lives after becoming the first ever to leave this world. It was even a Christmas story. The more I read about Apollo 8, the more startling it seemed that so little had been written about it. This is the best space story of them all, I thought, and I was not the only one. Early in my research, I came across interviews with the late Neil Armstrong, the first man to set foot on the moon, and himself a backup crew member for Apollo 8. He remembered how excited all the astronauts and NASA personnel had been for Apollo 8, how it changed the course of the entire American space program. It was an enormously bold decision, he told an interviewer on film. But it was the way he said enormously that stayed with me. In ways, it sounded like Armstrong thought Apollo 8 to be an even bigger leap for mankind than landing on the moon. Other astronauts and NASA personnel said as much directly. When asked to compare Apollo 8 to his historic flight aboard Apollo 11, astronaut Mike Collins said, "As you look back 100 years from now, which is more important, Apollo 8 or Apollo 11? I think probably you would say Apollo 8 was of more significance than Apollo 11. For NASA's legendary flight director, Chris Kraft, it was simple. It took more courage to make the decision to do Apollo 8, he said, than anything we ever did in the space program. None of these men remembered having dry eyes as Borman, Lovell, and Anders spoke to the world on Christmas Eve as they circled the moon. All of them, along with billions of others in the world, more than any that had ever listened to a human voice at once, remembered what these 3 astronauts said. To understand what made Apollo 8 so historic, bold, and daring, it's important to understand what was happening at NASA and in the world in 1968. NASA was under immense pressure on two fronts. First, to keep the promise made by President John F. Kennedy in 1961 to land men on the moon and return them safely to Earth by the end of the decade. Second, and maybe even more important, to beat America's Cold War enemy, the Soviet Union, in the race to send the first men to the moon. By the summer of 1968, things looked bleak on both fronts. Development of the lunar lander, the spidery landing craft that would move astronauts from the orbiting ship to the lunar surface and back again, threatened to stall the Apollo program and put Kennedy's deadline, just 16 months away, out of reach. Around the same time, a top-secret memo was issued by American intelligence officials warning that the Soviets might send men around the moon as early as late 1968. NASA had no plans to send the men to the moon in 1968. The soonest they looked ready to try was mid-1969, when Apollo 10 would orbit the moon, a test run before Apollo 11 attempted a landing. But by that time, a cosmonaut might already have reached the moon, and that would be more than just the greatest technological achievement in history. It would be a definitive victory for the Soviets in the space race, and a powerful argument that their science, their political system, and their way of life were superior. The moon landing would still matter, of course, but no one ever again would ask, can we get there? By that time, our greatest enemy would have answered, we already did. But what could NASA do about all this? The lunar module simply wasn't ready to go, and as long as it remained on the shelf, it looked like Apollo just had to wait. And then a quiet man had an epiphany. At 41 years of age, George Low was already a top manager and one of the most important people at NASA, in charge of making sure the Apollo spacecraft was flight-worthy. He was a precise and serious man whose subjects and verbs always agreed, even while he gave dictation, and who would sunbathe on the weekends with his briefcase beside him, never missing a chance to think or to plan. And here was George Low's plan for America. Instead of waiting for the lunar module to be made ready, he proposed sending a manned flight to the moon without one. Of course, that meant the astronauts would not land on the moon, but rather orbit for 10 revolutions over 20 hours at an altitude of just 69 miles. But not landing hardly mattered. If NASA could get men around the moon soon, really soon, the Apollo program could be kept moving. The agency could prove many of the techniques, equipment, and procedures necessary for making a lunar landing. And America had a fighting chance to beat the Soviets in the race to get the first human beings to the moon. Low and Kraft decided that flight would be Apollo 8, originally designed for low Earth orbit, and it would happen in just 4 months' time, in December 1968. When NASA's top administrator and boss, James Webb, first heard of the plan, he screamed into the phone, and this is a quote, "Are you out of your mind? You're putting the agency and the whole program at risk." And he was right. Ordinarily, it took 12 to 18 months for NASA to plan a space mission and for its astronauts, engineers, and controllers to train for it. Now, Low was proposing they do it in only 4 months. And that was just the start of the madness. To fly to the moon in late December 1968, Apollo 8 would be going without a lunar module. That meant, of course, the mission could not land on the moon. But the lunar module also served as a backup engine, a lifeboat of sorts. Going without it meant that if Apollo 8's single engine failed or malfunctioned at the moon, the crew could smash into the lunar surface or be stranded in lunar orbit or fly off toward the sun, never to come home. And then there was the matter of the rocket. Only the behemoth Saturn V was powerful enough to deliver astronauts and their spacecraft to the moon. But the Saturn V had never flown with men aboard and had only been tested twice, the second of which had been a near disaster. Now, Low was proposing that the rocket's third ever flight take 3 men, each of whom had children and families, 240,000 miles away, to a place no human had ever dared venture. Piled high on these risks were a smorgasbord of others. I deal with them in Rocket Men, and I must tell you, any of them can make your heart stop. Often when I was writing, I'd remove my glasses, push myself away from the computer, and say out loud, I cannot believe these guys did this. And there was a final danger, and I want to mention it here because in ways it was the gravest of them all. It was expressed by James Webb when he first heard of George Low's plan. If these three men are stranded out there and die in lunar orbit, Webb said, no one, lovers, poets, no one, will ever look at the moon the same way again. No one had considered that. But it was true of Christmas, too. Borman, Lovell, and Anders would be in lunar orbit on December 25th. If they died then, Christmas would never be the same in America, or maybe all the world. Every year, it would be a tragic reminder of a mission gone horribly wrong. So in ways you could say we were all at risk when Apollo 8 stood ready on the launch pad on December 21st, 1968. But if NASA could pull it off, if Borman, Lovell, and Anders could pull it off, if America could pull it off, think of what that small spacecraft, the one on display in this very museum, could do. It could deal a devastating blow to an existential enemy. It could help the United States come together at the end of one of its most terrible and divisive years. It could deliver human beings to a place they dreamed of going since mankind first walked the earth. And with that, I introduce you to Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, the first men ever to leave Earth and the first men ever to arrive at the moon.
You got to pull that mic up.
Loud enough?
Don't cross your legs.
Okay.
Don't cross your legs.
Okay, gentlemen, here we go. Frank, you told me early on that by the time the mission change for Apollo 8 came in, you already believed you had one of the finest crews NASA had ever assembled. What made you confident in these guys and in yourself?
Well, I firmly believed it at that time, and I believe it even more strongly now. Of course, Jim and I had spent 14 days in Gemini 7, and that was a grinding, grueling flight. Something like that, you spend 2 weeks in a volume smaller than the front seat of a Volkswagen Beetle. We got so friendly that toward the end of the flight, we were both sharing a toothbrush.
We declared we were engaged after we got done.
We got out of the spacecraft, walked up on the carrier, and the first thing Lovell says is, Frank and I want to announce our engagement. And Bill Anders was known throughout the astronaut corps as a hardcore, hardworking, competent guy, and I trusted him immaculately. We didn't have time to fool around. In 4 months, we had to do it, and that was. I was right. These are the best guys that ever flew.
Jim, you were originally training for a low Earth orbital mission. Can you describe what it felt like to have your flight changed suddenly to the first manned mission to the moon?
Well, it's an interesting story because the three of us were going to do an Earth orbital mission. We were going to take a lunar module up into Earth orbit and then test it as we orbited the Earth, even separate. And Bill was the lunar module pilot and come back. And then after that, we would discharge the lunar module, go up to a high altitude and come back as if we were coming back from the moon. Two things happened in the summer of 1968 that changed the whole thing completely. The first thing was the fact that we had intelligence information, I think that Robert mentioned it, that the Russians were going to put a man or men circumnavigate the moon, not orbit the moon, but just go out and circumnavigate and come back. And the second thing we found out was the fact that Grumman Aircraft, who built the lunar module, wouldn't get it ready for a 1968 flight. They said the earliest would be 1969 before we would have this vehicle ready. And so suddenly we changed the mission. And as I think Robert mentioned, Robert Lowe has started at NASA headquarters, thought of this idea about sending Apollo 8 to the moon if Apollo 7 was successful on an Earth orbital. And Bill and I and Frank were at California testing the command module at that time, and they called Frank to come home to Houston, and that's when they announced to Frank that they were changing the mission. And then Frank came back and told us, so it was quite a change in that short period of time.
Bill, as I mentioned, the Saturn V, still the most powerful machine ever built to this day, had been tested only twice before Apollo 8, both times unmanned, and that second test, as Chris Kraft explained to me, was a near disaster. Were you concerned about being the first humans to ride this beast, which generated the power of a small atomic bomb?
Well, Frank had a major role in not only checking out the spacecraft after the fire, but also specialized in following the rocket development almost as soon as he came into the program. And he'd been trained at Caltech and others in that kind of thing. And so I figured if Frank had expected it and I had confidence in his ability, then I was going to, I thought it was a great way to serve my country and show the world that the United States system and capitalism and free enterprise, it was a better way to go than the Soviet Union approach.
And Bill, when you talk about serving your country, one of the first things you told me when I asked you about the dangers and the worry about risking your life was your thinking about your brothers in Vietnam at the time. Can you talk about that?
Well, it always embarrassed me when people would say, oh, gee, that was so dangerous on Apollo 8. And yet, we all had colleagues over in Vietnam who were being shot at. Frankly, chasing Russians over the North Sea and Iceland, which I was doing not too long before that, I considered more dangerous, even though Apollo was dangerous, more dangerous than Apollo 8.
So, Jim, there's so much we could discuss about the training, but I want to get to the flight because so much happened. I love the story you told me about riding to the top of the launch tower on launch day. And while Bill and Frank were getting in to the command module, you had occasion to look down to the crowd below and to the lights. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, we arrived at the Saturn V before light, very early in the morning, and we went up the gantry, the elevator actually all the way up about 360 feet, and then there was sort of a railing and a little a bridge that Bill and Frank walked across into the command module itself. There was only room enough for those two, and I just stayed behind, and I suddenly looked down, and I could see the lights of the press corps coming into their spots about that time, and I thought to myself, they're going to send us to the moon. Suddenly dawned on me, this is not a Gemini flight this time. Am I sure I want to go? And then I followed Bill and Frank into the spacecraft and got strapped in. I said, I guess they're serious about it.
And Bill, you told me something incredible, that at some point while strapped into your seat and awaiting liftoff on man's first journey to the moon, you fell asleep. Is that possible? And how does that happen with just an hour or two to go?
Well, I mean, it was clearly nothing much I could do. We checked all the switches and everything was in the right position. And I figured, no sense in getting all worked up about this. And so somewhere along the line, I fell asleep. It was probably the longest sleep I had on the whole flight.
I may want to reconsider this about the crew. But before the flight, I had a full head of hair.
Frank, you mentioned to me that the average age of those who programmed your trajectory to the moon was about 24.
Say again?
That the average age of those who programmed the trajectory to the moon was about 24 years old. Did that give you any pause climbing in?
One of the remarkable things about NASA at that time, people that were there all were willing to subordinate every factor of their life, their families, their health, everything to the success of the mission. We three of us were very fortunate to exist and work in that kind of an environment. They all, from Jim Webb, the administrator, down to the lowest employee at NASA, wanted to win, wanted to beat the Russians to the moon. And I always very, very confident and grateful in being in that kind of an environment. And I tell you something else. When you work for somebody in NASA, if you didn't do your job, you didn't work there tomorrow. It was that kind of an environment. There weren't such things as microaggressions or safe spaces.
And keep in mind that the cell phone that I have in my pocket has more computing power than the whole NASA control room today. And they were.
I didn't know that till you told me today. I didn't really.
Now he's worried.
Before Apollo 8, no human had ever ridden the Saturn V or experienced that kind of power. I know the three of you trained for it and they tried to simulate it, but Bill, what was the actual experience like and how did it compare to your simulation?
Well, after Jim woke me up just before launch, in fact, there was a little bug that was making a mud dauber nest. I thought, boy, you're in for a surprise here. But when the rocket lit off, it was so noisy. I mean, even these guys who'd flown before, I don't think had the noise in the initial 20 seconds before we cleared the tower. But it was so noisy that had I noticed anything wrong on the instrument panel, which was vibrating like mad and I couldn't see it anyway, I mean, I couldn't have communicated to them. And as we lifted slowly, the huge engines were gimbling down at the bottom, and we were like a ladybug on the end of a whip antenna, an old-fashioned antenna on your car, and it was violent. And Frank was smart enough to take his hand off the abort handle for fear, you know. And like any other fighter pilot, he'd rather be dead than screw up.
That's true.
And but once we cleared the tower, which I thought we were bouncing up with the fin, once we cleared the tower, things started smoothing out, and it was a manageable event.
Well, you have to see the size of that Saturn V to appreciate it. The one thing that always sticks in my mind, it's still the most powerful machine ever built. And I think it burned per second. You all can keep me honest on it. I think it was something like 5,000 gallons of fuel a second.
15 tons.
How much?
15 tons.
15 tons.
And it wasn't number 9 coal either, but...
in 1 second.
1 second.
Jim, Apollo 8 marked the first time mankind had ever seen Earth as a full sphere. What was it like to see such a sight and to watch the Earth grow smaller as you sped toward the moon?
Well, that was probably the high point of my flight, to finally get to the moon. And as we came around the moon, we suddenly saw the Earth, which was a small blue and white ball. And I've said this many, many times when I first looked at it, to put my thumb up and then I could hide the Earth completely behind my thumb, realizing that behind my thumb there was about 5 billion people, and everything I ever knew was behind my thumb. And I suddenly realized, a different perspective of my position in the universe. The Earth itself is just a small planet around our solar system, consisting of 9 planets. And in our galaxy, the Earth is merely a speck. And in our universe, it just is lost in oblivion. So, suddenly realized what we're doing, how we got there, and how faithful, how lucky we are that we had a body that had the proper weight, or the proper mass, I should say, to have a gravity that contained water and an atmosphere that was necessary for life, and that it orbited a star at just the right distance, not too far out to be too cold, in too close to be too hot, but just to the right distance to absorb that star's energy. And that energy was what caused life to evolve in the beginning. So I felt very, very lucky.
Frank, you'd been flying since about age 15, if I remember correctly. And you'd never been sick before on an airplane, or even 2 weeks aboard Gemini 7 with Jim. But suddenly you're on your way to the moon and something happens. Can you describe that?
Yes, it was sometime after we were en route to the moon that I got up out of the couch to take a rest period, and I we slept in kind of like a sleeping bag enclosure under the seats. And I got down in that, and I began to feel nauseous and sick, and sure enough, pretty soon I was sick. And I can't explain. At the time, I thought it was because I'd taken a Seconal sleeping pill. I don't take pills, but I'd taken one to try to get to sleep. And I thought it was that. But I think now, in looking back at it, it was probably an example of motion sickness. But Jim and I had never had it in 14 days on Gemini 7, even though we were tumbling a lot with lack of reaction to control fuel. But I suspect that it was probably that.
And Bill, you gave me the most fascinating, even elegant description of how Frank's sickness made its way through the cabin. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you to describe.
Have you got a bag?
Careful.
Without embarrassing Frank, first of all, there was a rather unpleasant smell. And I grabbed an oxygen mask, which was supposed to only be used for fire. Jim said, "Oh, you can't use that." And I said, "To hell with that." Pretty soon he had one on too. But out of the equipment bay came this slightly bigger than a golf ball size orb. And it was kind of disgusting, but and then my physicist mind took over because it had a three-dimensional flexing to it. And I thought, boy, that is fascinating, you know. And it started coming up in the general vicinity of Gemini, and then it broke apart. And one went this way, and as conservation momentum demanded, the other way went right at Jim Lovell's chest. I'll never forget his eyes following it splat like an omelet on his.
Robert, I want to thank you for bringing that up.
Sorry.
You brought it up.
What did he say?
Well, when I spoke to Chris Kraft, he explained that this was a very serious situation and that they contemplated ordering the mission back. Had they done that, would you have strictly followed orders, or could you have kept going?
There's no way in God's green earth that I was going to cancel it because I puked a couple times. Just no way. And frankly, I'll be very candid with this group here tonight. I was concerned because the medical profession at that time was very anxious to make its name in the space medicine business. And I thought that just some of the actors down there would get in, beat their chest, and say, "Oh, for the health of the crew, we've got to bring him home." Well, I wasn't going to come home if I had a heart attack. But
well, Jim and I didn't decide at the time, but I'm sure both of us thought that if he really was sick, we'd just throw him out the hatch.
That's right.
And go on ourselves.
We were going to go one way, then that's it.
But it all worked out.
Well, it was fascinating to me to learn that even in the last minutes of your outbound journey, you still hadn't spotted the moon. In fact, as you were closing in, Mission Control asked what you were seeing, and Bill, you answered nothing. It's like being on the inside of a submarine. But that changed with about a minute to go before the spacecraft was scheduled to slip behind the moon. Jim, you said, "We'll see you on the other side." And then Bill, what you were seeing changed. Can you take us through that?
Well, we were, first of all, went out of sight of the Earth. So the Earth shine, which is pretty bright, made us see stars, and then we went into the lunar shadow. So we were in the double umbra, to get technical about it. And it just made so many stars visible that you couldn't see constellations. I mean, you could see, they were just, even the dimmest stars were bright. So there was this mass of stars. And then I looked back, and here was this big black hole. And my hair went up on the back of my neck, and that was the moon blotting out all the other stars. And it still gives me a little eerie feeling with that.
So soon enough, you become the first 3 humans ever to lay eyes on the far side of the moon. Can you describe that moment, and if there were any surprises to you when you first saw it?
I think that we were like 3 schoolboys looking through a candy store window. suddenly we forgot the flight plan, and just 60 miles below there was the lunar surface with the ancient old craters. And all three of us tried to describe what we saw. It looked like maybe cement that had been, a pick had hit it and splattered all the dust around this hole. It was quite a sight. We had pictures of the far side before we got there, but this was the first time that people live had actually seen the far side. And it was quite an experience to see how the sun produced the shadows of the lunar surface, and with no atmosphere, of course, it was very stark.
And the pictures that had been taken by Soviet unmanned spacecraft were very poor resolution. So this was a big surprise, how rough the backside looked.
How about you, Frank? Were there any surprises when you first laid eyes on the moon? Any surprises for you when you first laid eyes?
No, really, I hadn't studied the geology as much as Jim and Bill had, and it was something that nobody had ever seen before. It was totally interesting, and I looked at it and I was fascinated, and then I went back to looking at what we were supposed to be looking at. Hint, hint.
Frank said, well, we're here, let's go home.
I think there's some truth in that, because, Frank, I think when you were planning the mission at first, you wanted one orbit and that was it. Yeah. You don't want to mess around further than that, but NASA insisted as long as you were going, you should do more. And they finally won that argument. Why did you relent in that argument?
Well, this is another interesting thing about the NASA of our era. Ordinarily, to plan a flight plan, to create a flight plan for a flight like that would take months, maybe 5 or 6 months. But the NASA was led by unique people, and Chris Kraft was one of them. He's the only one still alive. But we met in his office one afternoon at 1 o'clock with a group of his experts, and by 5 o'clock we had planned, in 4 hours, we'd planned a flight plan. We had achieved a flight plan that was essentially unchanged. And it was basically due to his leadership. But Jim was right. My main concern in this whole flight was to get there ahead of the Russians and get home. That was a significant achievement in my goal, in my eyes. But Kraft was right. While we were there, we needed to get the most we could for future flights. And we wrestled around. First, they wanted infinite number of orbits, and then 12, and finally we settled on 10. But that was the wonderful thing. When I looked around the room at that meeting, there were people that knew what they were doing. Fortunately, there wasn't anybody there from Washington. And now that we're here in Chicago, I could say there wasn't anybody there from Springfield, Illinois either. But that was NASA at that time. Really competent people that knew what they were doing, and a boss. And the boss was Kraft. And I tell you, if you know Chris Kraft, you know where you stand with him. You're either in good graces or you're out. So I think we were blessed as a country to have leaders like that.
Jim, just after the first of the 2 TV broadcasts from the moon, you reported something that might have sounded strange to Mission Control. After describing several famous landmarks, you then said, "I can see the old second initial point here very well, Mount Marilyn. Aren't lunar landmarks supposed to be named after ancient astronomers and the like? What was Mount Marilyn?"
Well, let me explain this. As we were training to go to the moon, we had some pictures, of course, photographs of the near side of the moon, and we were looking at our orbits around the moon. And on the shore of the Sea of Tranquility was a little triangular mountain that pointed sort of into where we thought the first landing would go into, which turned out to be Apollo 11. And so just, half jokingly and anything, I told Bill and Frank, I'm naming this Mount Marilyn, little triangular mountain. And sure enough, on Apollo 8, we went around there, and there was the little Mount Marilyn, and we named it. And then Apollo 10 went there later on, and they did what was called an approach and an abort, which was part of the team just to see if the abort could be okay. And they took a picture of Mount Maryland as it passed by, and they started their way down. And then on Apollo 11, of course, they used Mount Maryland as the initial point to start the landing into the Sea of Tranquility. Well, the little name sort of got a life of its own. Started to show up in various publications and then books. And when Apollo 13 came out, we mentioned Mount Maryland. And when they talked about Apollo 8, Mount Maryland. And finally, I petitioned people of the International Astronomical Union, can we name this little place Mount Maryland? And they said, no, we named this after ancient philosophers and astronomers. You know, you got to be kidding. And then, that was about 2014 or something like that, when that happened. And then finally, someone up there said, you know, we need a little romance with this program. You just can't have all this. And so eventually, this last July, Mount Maryland was officially named, and it's there now and in perpetuity. This little triangular mountain on the near side of the moon will always be there.
During Apollo 8's fourth orbit, I want to make an argument that one of the most important things in human history occurred. You all witnessed a scene that had you scrambling for your cameras. Bill, can you describe what happened then? Because you are about to take one of the most powerful and important photographs of all time.
Well, one of my secondary jobs, primary job, was make sure the spacecraft worked, systems all performed like they should, but was to take pictures of the lunar surface, and had a extremely ambitious schedule of every minute, every second, taking a picture this way and that way, and nobody had thought about taking any pictures of the Earth. And I think Jim or somebody said, or maybe Frank, gee, look at that. Suddenly here was this beautiful, fragile-looking planet, our own home planet, coming up, and particularly is emphasized over the stark lunar horizon. I grabbed a camera. I think Frank says, hey, that's not on the flight plan, Bill, don't take it. He was just kidding. But I grabbed a big long lens that Frank didn't want me to take in the first place, and finally talked Lovell into giving me some color film, and started machine gunning this thing. We had no light meter, no training in taking anything but lunar surface, and just, you know, changed the f-stop and started clicking away. And one of those pictures, it's not a world-class Ansel Adams type picture, but it was chosen as the iconic Earthrise picture.
Yeah, he was the photographer for this. But I told him how to take the
both
picture.
Jim and Frank claimed they took it, but...
And Jim and Frank, what impression did the sight of Earthrise make on you when you saw it?
Well, of course, it was quite magnificent, and it kept in our minds. And of course, we didn't know really the significance of Bill's picture until we got home, and other people started to see really what they had to live with, what they were living on. And I think that was perhaps one of the most significant aspects of the Apollo 8 flight, because it brought people back into a position of that the Earth is small, and that theoretically we should all be working together. And this, in just one photograph, told everything.
Yes.
I might observe that somewhere along the line, I made the comment that it's ironic, I thought, that we came to explore the moon, and what we discovered was the Earth.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I think, a famous statement that Bill made, that we went to explore the moon, and instead we really discovered the Earth.
Yeah.
With about 7 hours remaining at the moon, the three of you needed to prepare not just to leave lunar orbit, but for your final television broadcast. Both of these were critically important elements of the mission. But by this point, it's clear from reading the flight transcript that you were all tired and starting to make some mistakes. I would like to read, Frank, a bit of what you said to your crewmates, because it occurred on Christmas Eve and sounds so much...
Watch the language, please.
I will. I have a lot of red pen in here. It occurred on Christmas Eve and sounds so much like so many conversations people on Earth have every Christmas Eve in their own homes. Go to bed. Get going. I think this is a closed issue. Get to bed. No, you get to bed. Get your ass to bed. I don't want to talk about it. Shut up, go to sleep, both you guys.
You're really grumpy.
Don't worry about the camera exposure business, damn it, Anders. Get to bed. You've only got a couple hours, Bill, before we're going to have to be fresh again. So, Frank, I wrote in the book that even at the moon, it's a military chain of command, and you were the commander. Is that how you saw it?
No, look, this was a collaborative effort. And Jim and Bill were so motivated with trying to take pictures of the moon that I was concerned that they wouldn't be alert for the Earth orbital injection, the TEI, and so I was very concerned. As a matter of fact, they began to, Anders was slurring and Lovell was going to sleep on the job. So.
There might have been a chain of command, and we were good military guys, but I didn't close my eyes once. I just kept watching the moon go by.
It was, look, we had a great crew. We got along, and there was never any repercussion of that. And we finally got their ass to bed. That was simple.
Well, nearing the end of your lunar orbits, you made your final television broadcast from the moon. Weeks before liftoff, NASA told you that more people would be listening to your words than had ever listened to a human voice at one time, nearly a third of the world's population. Frank, surely NASA gave you, the commander, strict guidance on what to say during this broadcast on such a momentous occasion. What did they tell you to say?
To me, this is one of the great hallmarks of our country, because the only instructions that were related to me when I asked them about the lunar broadcast on Christmas Eve, I said, well, you have a script, what do you want us to do? And the only instruction that I got from NASA, from the government, was to do something appropriate. And so, that's remarkable. Can you imagine what would happen if we had been Russians sitting there? My God, we'd have been yelling about Clinton and everybody else. But I came back and talked to Jim and Bill, and we all tried for quite a while to figure out something, and it all came up trite or foolish. And finally, I had a really dear friend in Washington, Cy Borgen, and I asked him. He was an intellectual, sensitive guy, and he'd worked for Newsweek, and he was a wonderful person, but he couldn't figure out anything either. So finally, he asked a friend, Joe Leighton, and Joe Leighton said that he stayed up all one night until about 4 in the morning. Finally, his wife came down and said, what are you trying to do? She said, I'm trying to figure out something for them to use around the moon. And his wife said, well, why don't you start at the beginning, the first 10 verses of Genesis? His wife, incidentally, was a French resistance fighter, and had been raised in a nunnery, or whatever you call it, Catholic. So I came back and told Bill and Jim, and instantly we agreed that it was the appropriate thing to do. We typed it in the flight plan, and frankly, I never thought anything more about it. Did you guys think anything more about it until we read it? I didn't think anything more about it.
No, it was on the last page of the flight manual, and we said, Bill, you take the first third, I'll take the middle third, you end with the last third.
Yeah. And that's how it came about. Interestingly enough, I guess even back then in America, there were a lot of atheists around. We got sued. But the difference back then was the district court that she sued us in refused to hear it, and the Supreme Court threw out her appeal. So
Well, I didn't personally consider it a religious message, even though I was religious at the time. I thought that it was more a message just to give the a background of how serious man's first departure from his home planet was to humankind, and Frank's friends and Frank's choice was particularly appropriate for that.
But you know something,
from my standpoint, it was perfectly appropriate for that reason. That's what
it
might
was
have
very
been.
appropriate, but a script writer could not have done a better job preparing for this flight of the sequence of events that occurred with all the troubles and the turmoil that the country was having at the time, to end up with a flight to the moon that everybody favored, that was positive, and that we could read something that would relate to the creation of what we are now looking at, and to come back on just about the end of the year. I thought that was.
And Frank quipped later that one of the biggest accomplishments of Apollo 8 was getting Anders, who was then a good Catholic, to read from the King James Version of the Bible.
That's right. I brought him along. You know, he was.
Well, Chris Kraft told me that trans-Earth injection, the maneuver required to get the spacecraft out of lunar orbit and on its way back to Earth, might have been the most dangerous part of the entire mission. Jim, can you explain what made that so dangerous?
Well, we had a regular plan to go down. I had a series of events to get ready to go. Once we passed communication, which was in the near side of the moon, and we came around to the far side, where we lose communication with the ground, then all they had to do was just wait, because they wouldn't know whether the engine would light or not light. If the engine didn't start, and we'd still be in lunar orbit, and if we never got it started, we'd be a satellite of the moon. Or if it's something that happened and only burned half the time, we might be in some oblique orbit that would be going around. And of course, Frank was very concerned. He wanted to make sure we were doing everything and got everything down. And finally, I was looking at the computer, and it was counting down, and my job was to handle the disk key, the part of the computer. And it finally got down to where a light came on and said, you have
Proceed.
5 seconds to go to count down. And then the light came, proceed, and Bill says, or Frank says, hit the button, hit the button, hit the button. So I hit the button, and the engine came on, fortunately, and lasted on this appropriate time to give us the velocity to eventually escape from from Moon's gravity on the way home.
And when Apollo 8 comes out of lunar orbit, Jim makes a broadcast that's remembered forever. Please be informed there is a Santa Claus.
Yeah.
So on the way home, Jim, you were taking sextant sightings as part of your duties as the mission's navigator. In fact, you'd become so good at it that something actually went wrong. Can you describe that for us?
Well,
It was just a technical
purposes of
problem.
the Apollo 8 flight was to test the navigation. And so while we're in the short period of time when we switched from an Earth orbital to a moon flight, I went up to MIT, the people that devised the navigational system, and I was learning and training on how to handle that. And then on the flight itself, I started to prepare, and the results of my navigation, the results looking at the stars, would be telemeter down, and the people at MIT saw how this coincided with their results, that it was getting to be very, very accurate as to what they had predicted would happen. And they said, and I said, well, I came up here a week before just to practice. So but anyway, I know what Robert is getting at. On the way home, I got so good that I was almost like a concert pianist playing.
He got so good he made a huge mistake.
So I hit the wrong button. And the guidance system told the spacecraft that we're no longer in orbit, but we're still on the launch pad. And they got furious. They got excited. They said, we're gone, we're lost. But I had no problems with it. We finally got back with the help of the ground. We got back on the proper course and the proper guidance.
Well, the ground knew where we were. I mean, to within a meter or two. It was amazing, the ground tracking. But they didn't know and we didn't know how we were. And we had like about 2 degrees that we could be off on a reentry. And if we were too steep, we could get burned up. If we were too shallow, we'd bounce out. So Jim had to really hustle to pick out. You couldn't really see stars. You hear one here or there, but you couldn't tell what constellation it is.
But what actually happened was the moon was also in the navigation system in its memory, and we could all see the moon. So the first thing that I aligned on was the moon, which gave us a rough alignment so that I could then pick out the stars and give us a more finer alignment, and we finally got back to where the spacecraft's attitude was also known so that we were in the proper position when we hit the atmosphere for a proper landing.
And that would serve you well on Apollo 13, if I'm not.
Yes, as a matter of fact, that on 13 we had to shut down this stuff. So, I mean, it wasn't a case of making a mistake. We lost the use of the navigational system on the way back to save electrical power. But as we were getting closer to the Earth, we had to fire it all up again, and so we used the same techniques, basically, of what we had learned on Apollo 8.
Robert, this brings about another interesting facet of NASA at that time. What Jim just described, where the platform was not aligned, was going to be the normal system, so you'd save fuel. When you took a rating, then you would turn it off, and you'd have to reline it again. And I looked at that, and it ended up in my experience in flying airplanes, if you got something working, leave it alone. So I wrote a letter to the program office, who forwarded it to MIT, and I got back a very formal letter from MIT engineer, and he listed all the reasons that we could shut it down and realign it, and he signed it. And at the bottom, he said, and this is a true story, I wish I'd have saved the letter, it said, P.S., if I were going on this mission, I'd let the damn thing run too. And we did. It ran on all the missions after that.
So really, Apollo 8 was just a training flight for Apollo 13. Right?
That's right.
In many ways, I think the story of Apollo 8 is just as much a story about your wives and their importance to the mission. Frank, can you speak to the importance of your wives?
Well, you know, you're looking at the only crew in Gemini or Apollo that still have the original wives. That's and I want to tell you from the bottom of my heart that I admire those women more than I can tell you, because they realized that they were, and their families were, subordinated to the mission. And yet all they did was pitch in and help and maintain a family, raise their kids, and do everything else. And they did it with pride, because they were as much a part of this deal as we were, really. And I think in a very real sense, it took more courage to be well, look at Valerie, 5 children. And Anders, you were a major, weren't you? Captain.
Well, major at that time.
Yeah, you're a major.
Somewhere along the line.
Yeah, he didn't even know his rank. What did he know about that? But I'm sincere. They were just as much a part of this as we were, and they were never really recognized, in my opinion, for their contributions. But they really did contribute.
Yeah, they were basically abandoned. I calculated that I was able to spend 11 minutes a week with each kid privately. And my wife Valerie, as did Jim and Frank's wives, made up the difference. And it was a strain on them. They were the real heroes.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes you have to work with the wives to make them realize how important they are, because sometimes they get lost in all the stuff that we were doing, and we were always gone. And so I sort of realized this was going to be the first flight to the moon, and as the time get closer and closer to the time, realized that the 3 of us would be going orbiting the moon on Christmas Day. So several months before the flight, when I thought that this was going to be true, I went to Neiman Marcus, and I bought a little fur coat, and I had the coat delivered on Christmas Day by a chauffeured limo driver coming in and handing my wife this package, and it said, "To Marilyn Lovell, Merry Christmas for the Man on the Moon."
Well, Robert, I think of all that's been written about Apollo, you're the only one that really attached the proper significance to the wives in the deal, because you deserve a lot of credit for that, too.
Well, the flight occurred at the end of 1968, which is arguably one of the most terrible and divisive years in our country's history. The whole country seemed divided against itself with no hope of coming together. And then Apollo 8 goes at the very, very end of this disastrous year. It was reported that before you launched, Time magazine had already decided on the dissenter as its Man of the Year. But by the time you come back, it names the crew of Apollo 8 its Men of the Year. That's an honor that the magazine wouldn't even bestow on the crew of Apollo 11 that made the first landing. Did any of you have any idea that Apollo 8 might have the kind of healing power that it did?
Go ahead. I had none.
Well, it was, we were living in a bit of a bubble in our training. We were so busy in simulators that I didn't really know all that was going on outside. Of course, I knew that Martin Luther King had been shot and Robert Kennedy, but all the little campus unrest and whatnot sort of went over my head. So I didn't realize how bad the year was until after, I think Frank we got back and Frank got a telegram or a message saying, "Thank you, you saved 1968.
Yeah. That was the first time I ever, but you're right. That was it.
And we'll take, people submitted a couple questions on Twitter I'd like to ask you from the crowd. Do you think that it will be worthwhile going back?
We haven't fired anybody today, I don't think. It's Twitter.
Was that the president?
Good thing we didn't have Twitter. Borman would have fired me earlier.
I can't hear what you're saying. That's probably good.
So, do you think it will be worthwhile going back to the moon, or should we focus on Mars, or both?
Or both?
Or both Mars and the moon? Is it worth going?
Well, I'm of the strong opinion that the radiation environment in deep space, which is out of the Earth's magnetosphere and atmosphere, even before you get to Mars, but the radiation, the negative effect of weightlessness or reduced gravity on the human body. I mean, the space station people can't even walk when they land, is going to preclude us from, certainly from going to Mars, maybe for 100 years, and may even make going back to the moon more difficult for extended periods of time. I know that's not very romantic, but that's my view anyway. Plus the fact there's nobody really willing to fund it. It's we were racing or winning the Cold War, and that was the American farmers and coal miners and workers wanted to show that we had a better system than the Soviet Union, and so they were willing to, for a while anyway, pay taxes to do that. We don't have that today. So I hate to sound so negative, but I think that's the fate of manned flight is pretty shaky right now. We have to hitch rides to get to the space station with the Soviet Union. I mean, how ridiculous is that? Lovell's more romantic about it, though, than I am.
Well, my opinion to the future of our space efforts should be, if it's going to be a manned flight, there's a lot of good robotic missions that are very, very helpful. We learn an awful lot. For instance, going to Mars now with a vehicle called Curiosity, who's been there for a couple of years now and has really explored robotically and sending the information back to the Earth. Has been a fantastic vehicle, and I really think that was the way to go. We know more about the Mars surface than Neil Armstrong knew about the moon surface when he landed because of this vehicle. But for manned flight, I think we should just continue to further explore the moon if we're going to do manned moon or manned missions into space, because there's a lot we can still learn about the moon. We've barely touched it, and if we're going to go in that direction, that's the way to go.
Well, I agree with that. I think the idea that we're going to Mars, what does Musk say? He's going to have a colony on Mars in the 20s? I think that's nonsense myself. And I do believe that we should concentrate from the standpoint of man on a scientific community on the moon, like the South Pole. But you got to recognize that the Apollo program was a battle in the Cold War. That's why it was funded, the competition with the Soviets. I don't see any inclination, and ever since Apollo, every president has talked about doing this or doing that, but none of it's really been funded. And I don't see any grassroots swelling of opinion in the country to fund this thing. So I believe a slow approach and going back to the moon first makes more sense from a man standpoint.
And I'll ask one final question from Twitter. If you
From
could
where?
This is one more from Twitter.
From Twitter, I don't want to get fired.
See, that's what I said earlier. If we had Twitter, you'd have fired me already.
If you gentlemen could go back and pick another career other than astronaut, what would it have been?
Well, I already was in a career. I was in the Navy. That would have been my career.
Bill, would you have been a geologist, do you think?
Well, if I wasn't going to be a fighter pilot, which is really what I was trained and loved to do, and have to go to Vietnam or wherever, I would have probably been a geologist.
Yeah, me too. I was already in the Air Force. I loved it. I love flying fighters, and I would go back to the Air Force.
Frank, one of your sons told me that just a week or two after you returned from the moon, you were working at a gas station with him, working on cars, and an ornery customer gave you some gruff, and pretty soon you were in a scrap with him. And your son looked over before he broke it up and said, "This guy does not know he's fighting with the first man ever to reach the moon." So I always thought you might work repairing cars.
Well, I was mad at Edwin for breaking it up. I was going to hit that son of a bitch.
Well, this has been terrific. I'd like to read some closing remarks, if we could. As we continue to push further into the final frontier, the unwavering courage of the men here tonight is the foundation upon which that future is built. What we owe these rocket men for their selflessness is impossible to pay back, yet I hope we can continue to try to find a way. As David Messina mentioned earlier, the Museum of Science and Industry is home to the actual Apollo 8 capsule in which the crew made history. It can be found in the Henry Crown Space Center, along with Frank Borman's spacesuit and Bill Anders' world-famous Earthrise photo. Apollo 8 is just the start. Tonight, I, along with David Messina and the museum staff, invite you to explore. Stand inside a 40-foot funnel to feel the power of nature around you. See with your own eyes the alarming changes our fragile planet is facing. Learn how humans have gotten more sophisticated in getting themselves from one place to another over the centuries, and experience the awe of the 700-ton U-505 submarine, whose capture served a key turning point for the Allied forces in World War II, much like Apollo 8 did for the space race. Its story is riveting, and I encourage you to see this National Historic Landmark for yourself. Finally, I want to say thanks to the 3 astronauts who joined us tonight, not just for proving that mankind might go anywhere, not just for saving 1968, but for showing us that great things can be done by really good guys, and that this wonderful country of ours can do anything, even something impossible, if we're all in it together, if we all believe we can. Thank you, Frank, Jim, and Bill, the first men ever to leave Earth, the first men ever to reach the moon. Good night.